This video is for part 3 of chapter 3. This one is looking at biogeochemical cycles, so understanding that biogeochemical cycles are looking at the movement of certain nutrients and things that are essential for life. Remember that it also demonstrates the conservation of matter, meaning it's changing through different forms into different things, but it's never actually disappearing. Okay, so when we talk about nutrient cycles, are also known as biogeochemical cycles, remember that these things are driven directly or sometimes indirectly by solar energy, and also gravity plays an important role. As nutrients are moving through these cycles, they can accumulate in things called reservoirs. And reservoirs are basically just areas where these different nutrients get stored. Okay, and so examples of reservoirs would be things like oceans, the atmosphere, or underground. And these nutrients can stay in these reservoirs for various periods of time. So sometimes it can be millions of years or hundreds of millions of years. Sometimes it can be a very brief period of time. So the first cycle is the water cycle. Remember that the water cycle is one that is definitely powered by solar energy. It focuses and centers around three processes, which are evaporation, precipitation, and transpiration. And so it's basically with those three processes is looking at how water is moving through the different phases of matter, from gas, liquid, and solid, and all of those things. When we look at the water cycle, remember there are different terms that are involved. There are different things that are involved. Remember that the primary reservoir for the water cycle is the ocean. When water falls or precipitates, it's going to hit the ground, it's going to hit the surface, and then it runs off into different directions depending on the contours of the land. And so that's referred to as runoff or surface runoff. Sometimes, depending on location, water can accumulate in ice caps or glaciers. Those are smaller reservoirs, but the largest reservoir for water, of course, is going to be the ocean. And the ocean does contain 70% of the water on the Earth's surface. So this diagram right here is a really important one because it talks about, or it shows, the different natural processes that are happening, such as precipitation, condensation, evaporation, also transpiration, which is water loss from plants as the water goes and exits through the openings under the leaves called the stomata and goes back into the atmosphere. Infiltration and percolation is the water basically soaking or seeping through the ground and going back into aquifers, which is that rock that stores water. And then you also, of course, have the things that are in red, which are showing the human impact. So what are things that we're doing? Things like overpumping or overpumping groundwater from aquifers, which is something that is very, very commonly seen with agriculture, but especially with the bottled water industry. So a majority of bottled water is coming from the underground aquifers, and that's where that water is being pumped. And then, of course, we've got water pollution, which we'll talk about later on in the year, and how that part works. For this page, make sure that you go over this, even though it's kind of a different section. This is just talking about why water is so important for living things. This is a review from Bio. Remember that water is a solvent. It's basically the best solvent, meaning because of those unevenly shared electrons between the hydrogens and the oxygens, it's got that slightly positive and negative end, so it can be disruptive to other chemical bonds, so it can break things down over time. Liquid water also requires or has a high specific heat, meaning it can absorb a lot of heat before those hydrogen bonds will break, and it will change from a liquid to a gas. And then some other examples of properties of water would be the fact that it can exist as a liquid over a really wide range of temperature. So make sure you go over that. All right, the next part is the carbon cycle. Remember that carbon is focused on carbon, the element carbon, but also different compounds and molecules of carbon. The primary one, of course, is going to be CO2. Remember that CO2 is going to be constantly moving in and out between different sources and sinks. And remember that a source is any process in one of these cycles that is going to release that substance into the ecosystem or into the atmosphere. And then a sink is going to be a reservoir that's going to take up that chemical element from another point or another part of its natural life cycle. And so carbon is going to cycle a lot between photosynthesis, because remember, carbon dioxide comes in, but it produces a carbon compound primarily in the form of glucose. And then, of course, you've got cellular respiration, which is going to break that down, and it's going to produce carbon dioxide as a waste. So that carbon is constantly cycling through those different things for living organisms. Remember that some carbon can be held in the atmosphere for very, very long periods of time, or it can also be held in marine sediment. So as organisms and things die, they sink to the bottom, they get covered by sand and silt and other things, and over time it compresses, and those deposits get buried. Well, those are things that eventually, over hundreds of millions of years, got converted into things such as oil. And so those are converted into our fossil fuels, oil and natural gas. Coal primarily comes from terrestrial-based plants, or what used to be like swamp plants, whereas oil comes from, or was primarily coming from, marine organisms. So remember that as we have these plants and animals, or these fossilized remains that decompose, they became fossilized, and they ended up being buried and stored underground for millions of years. Well, as we dig them up, as we process them, as we burn these fossil fuels, it's returning that carbon. That carbon was stored in that sediment in those fossil fuels, but now it's returning that carbon into the atmosphere, and it's returning it at a very, very rapid rate because we're burning so much of it. All right, so this diagram is the carbon cycle. So again, just like with the other ones, make sure you know this diagram, because again, it's talking about the natural processes, and then it also looks at things that we are doing, or humans are doing, to impact those natural processes. So make sure that you are able to explain the different parts. All right, so moving on to nitrogen, the nitrogen cycle. Remember that the nitrogen cycle is going to be, again, following the pathway of different elements and different molecules and carbon compounds, of nitrogen. And so the atmosphere is a major reservoir of nitrogen. A majority of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen gas, or N2. And so when we talk about how can that nitrogen be used, how can it be accessed by living things, the primary process that's going to happen, or the first thing that has to happen, is nitrogen fixation. And that is where you have certain types of microorganisms that are able to take that nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into a form of nitrogen that plants and animals can use, which is primarily ammonia, which is NH4. And then it goes through other processes, so that are talked about here in this diagram. But once it's ammonia is toxic to a lot of organisms, so there are other bacteria that then take that ammonia, or that NH4, and then process it or change it through a process called nitrification into nitrite, with an I, Nitrite, which is NO2 minus. And then there are some other bacteria that then convert that nitrite into nitrate, which is NO3 minus. And then once it's in those forms, it can be taken up by plants from soil, which is a process called assimilation. And then it's used by plants, and then the plants are eaten by animals, and then it gets converted that way. And then once you have these organisms that basically are going to excrete some of these wastes in the form of urine or feces, or you have plants and animals die, that process is ammonification, which is when decomposers are returning that nitrogen back into the soil. And then the last part is denitrification, which is another type of bacteria is going to return the nitrogen back into the atmosphere into a gaseous form, because what it's doing is it's processing that nitrate to break down and get oxygen in order to go through some of its metabolic processes. So some of the things that we're doing to interfere in the nitrogen cycle are things, it's primarily going to revolve around fertilizers, but we add nitrogen oxides to the atmosphere by burning gas and other fuels, and also by using nitrate fertilizers. We're adding nitrous oxides or N2Os through anaerobic bacteria, or through using anaerobic bacteria to produce commercial fertilizer. And then we remove large amounts of nitrogen gas from the atmosphere faster than it can be replaced by the cycle. And again, that gas is being used to process fertilizer or commercial grade fertilizer. All right. The next one, is the phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle, this one is different because it's the only biogeochemical cycle that does not have a gaseous state. So everything is pretty much involved on land in different physical compounds. The phosphorus cycle, again, is just tracing the movement of phosphorus through different forms. Remember that phosphorus is a key component of things like ATP, which is used for cellular energy processes. It's a structural component for DNA and RNA. And so the major reservoirs for phosphorus are rocks and sediments that contain those phosphorus-bearing minerals. Remember that because this phosphorus can be locked up in the form of rock until it's released by weathering and erosion, then it can act as something called a limiting factor, meaning it's going to, because it's available in limited amounts, it can keep a population from growing. Or it can, if it's available in large amounts, like with a lot of fertilizers, a lot of detergents that make their way into the water through runoff, we end up seeing things develop like algal blooms, which then a lot of algae gets produced because of the excessive amount of phosphorus that's now available. That is going to use up a lot of oxygen in the water, which will basically suffocate a lot of aquatic animals. And then it's also going to block out the sunlight for organisms that live closer down to the bottom. The last one is the sulfur cycle, which we're not really going to have to worry about too much. Yes, you still need to read about it, but the other ones are more important as far as knowledge for the AP exam. For the sulfur cycle, you do need to just kind of remember that it goes through different parts. Again, this is also one that's going to involve different types of rocks. And then it's also used as an example when we talk about acid deposition, especially when we go back to the pollution unit later on, where you have particles of sulfuric acid, which is H2SO4, that are starting to fall to the ground in droplets and particles, and they end up in water, or they can end up in the ground itself, which is dry acid deposition, and that helps to contribute to acid rain.